Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our latest webinar, How Does Government Work, with presenter Jordan O'Brien. I think this is the third presentation Jordan's done for us in the last few months. We're very grateful for that. Just a couple of reminders before we get going. Please mute yourself if you are not speaking. Ask your questions at any time in the chat at the bottom of the screen, and we'll go through those at the end of the presentation. And the session is being recorded to post on our website so we can share afterwards for anyone who can't attend today. Introduce our speaker, Jordan O'Brien from Porter O'Brien is a Fredericton-based communications agency. Partners Tim Porter and Jordan have a combined 50 years of experience in public relations, strategy, marketing, government relations, market research, and media training. Today, Jordan is going to talk about how does government work. To many in the private sector, government is an enigma. To many in the public sector, it is a struggle to find private sector consultants who understand how government works. Tim Porter and Jordan O'Brien both worked their way from the junior ranks of the civil service to the deputy minister level and bookended that experience with work in the private sector. This webinar explains the structure and decision-making process of government, as well as the role of lobbyists in influencing government decisions. With that, I'll hand it over to Jordan.
Thank you very much, Morgan. It's always nice to be introduced by someone that has as good of a haircut as I do, so thank you for that. So I'll pull up my presentation here and get started. As Morgan mentioned, I'm happy to take questions as we get through it. And I'll try to make this not too dense. I am a little bit of a governance and procedure nerd, so this can be a little dry in places. I'll try to keep it somewhat interesting and then as I go through kind of the government 101 piece. But before I start, just a little bit more about Tim and I and our firm. We have an office on Queen Street here in downtown Fredericton. We're the two partners with background that Morgan described. Tim worked in journalism before doing communications and intergovernmental roles in government. I worked in Ottawa in government relations and public relations in the private sector. A little bit of public sector time in Ottawa before coming back to New Brunswick, where I worked for the province for 12 years. Well, no, not 12 years, 10 years, starting 12 years ago. And I've been back in the private sector for the last 2 years. We also have a large group of associates that we work with that have a variety of expertise, people we have trusted relationships that we've worked with over the last decade or two. So today's agenda, I'm going to do a little bit of Government 101. This is kind of going to take you back to your first year university political science class, so sorry. That is those first 3 bullets. Then I'll talk a little bit about lobbying, which is one of the services that we offer. I have a case study on a lobbying project I was involved in federally that is very complex, but was successful, just to give a window into how hard this stuff can be to do. And then we'll wrap up and take questions. So Government 101, Canada is a constitutional monarchy. That means we have a monarch that is the ultimate power, and all power is exercised in her name. So as folks know, Queen Elizabeth is not just the Queen of England, she is the Queen of Canada, and that's a distinct title. She has 16 jobs. She's the Queen in a distinct role of 16 different countries. The executive branch of government, which is the premier, ministers, bureaucrats, civil servants, right down to the people that you talk to at the counter at Service New Brunswick, that's all part of the executive branch of government, and they all act in the name of the Crown. If you're being charged with a crime, it's the Crown versus you. If somebody's selling you some Crown land, it's the Crown and right of New Brunswick that's selling you that land, etc. The legislative branch, which federally is Parliament, provincially is the legislature, is where the elected people reside. And then in the judicial branch, we have the court system. Theoretically, those 3 branches are distinct in a theoretical system, but I'll talk about how that's not quite the case in our system. Canada and before us, Britain, kind of evolved into the system that we're in. In the United States, France, Russia, China, even Germany to some extent, Italy, Spain, all those countries came into their current systems by overnight a big change after a revolution, and out with the old, in with the new. That didn't happen here or in the UK. It was a very slow evolution from an absolute power monarchy to the system we have today. So a lot of that began with the Magna Carta in 1215, a couple of years ago, when there were first kind of set of written rules that constrained the power of the crown came into place. The next one I just kind of throw in is a bit of a joke that only somebody as big of a nerd as I am would think was funny, but it's an evolutionary change. But the revolution, if you look in English history, they have something called the Glorious Revolution in the late 1600s, which was actually the undoing of a revolution. So there was a brief period of time when Cromwell seized power and abolished the monarchy. And then when the monarchy was restored and then went back to the status quo, that's the only revolution we've had in our history. Responsible government, that's the notion that we have today, where the crown has to choose the cabinet and the premier from among the people that have the confidence of the legislature. And that's where we get a little bit of a fusion between the executive and the legislative branch in our system. And sometimes it's very difficult to see the difference between them because there's such a level of integration. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Now we have a minority government here and federally, so you see the difference a little more than you usually would. And then finally, repatriation of the Constitution. So a lot of people, when asked the question, when did Canada become a country? Most people would say July 1st, 1867, and that's not wrong, but the real answer is it's complicated. In 1867, we didn't have our own citizenship. We didn't have our own Supreme Court. Your Supreme Court was in the UK. We didn't have our own citizenship, and we couldn't amend our Constitution without permission of the British government. And between 1867 and 1982, we slowly gained those powers, and we really only became fully independent of the UK in 1982. So that's the slow revolution that we've gone through in this country. So the legislative branch I talked about before, they set the rules. What the crown, and i.e. the executive branch, cabinet, the premier, is allowed to do is set out by rules passed by the legislative branch. And that includes laws, taxes, and expenditure. The government cannot spend money or tax people and raise money without explicit permission from the legislature. And laws give them the power to do certain things and prohibit them from doing certain things. The federal legislative branch is two bodies, the House of Commons and the Senate. Federal laws don't become law until they pass both of those bodies. And provincially, we have what's called a unicameral legislature. That is, there's one house. Although in the past, we and other provinces had two. Most of those were merged in the 1800s, although Quebec continued to have two houses until 1968. Secondary legislation, which is the political science term for regulations, and I know chambers and chamber members talk a lot about regulations and regulatory burden. Those are secondary legislation, and that's legislation that's delegated to the executive. But government cannot make regulations on just anything. They can only make regulations that primary legislation passed by the legislature gives them power to. So if you read legislation, you'll often see language, the lieutenant governor and council, which is the crown, the cabinet, may make regulations related to X, Y, and Z. If that doesn't exist in legislation, then the regulation cannot be made. And one way to get rid of regulatory burden is to get rid of the regulations, but it's also another way is to get rid of the enabling legislation. So in a minority government situation, and an angle to get rid of a regulation that you don't like would be to convince the three opposition parties to bring forward a bill that would just take away the power from the government to regulate in that area anyway. The executive branch, it administers the rules that govern how we function, but those rules must be within the context granted by the legislature through laws, taxes, and expenditure. The responsible government concept that I talked about before results in a bit of a fusion. The premier is the leader of the party that has a majority of seats, or failing that, the party that can get a majority of MLAs to vote for its throne speech. And so, and particularly in majority governments, but even not, the executive branch more or less calls the shots and the legislative branch. And therefore it's kind of hard to see the daylight between them. So even now, where we have a minority government, the rules which were put in place by previous majority governments kind of give the government house leader and the premier a lot of say so on what happens in the legislature, whether or not they have the majority or not. So for example, the order in which legislation is debated is decided by the government house leader. There doesn't need to be a vote. So even though it's a minority legislature, the government still more or less controls the agenda. Doesn't mean they can pass everything that they want, but they have a lot of control on what comes up for a vote. I talked a bit about secondary legislation. So that's a kind of a two-way thing. The legislative branch creates the ability for the creation of secondary legislation or regulations, and then the executive branch can go and make them. The reserve powers of the crown. So the crown mostly does what she or her representative is told, and except for in a few areas which are called the reserve powers. So the figuring out who gets to form a government when there's no majority is a reserve power of the crown. And we saw that play out right here in New Brunswick a couple of years ago, where the Liberals were the incumbents and had fewer seats. The Conservatives were the outgoing opposition and had one more seat. Neither had a majority. And there was a lot of conversation about who got to go first and so on and so forth. And that played out. In British Columbia the year before that, it played out a little bit differently. Again, a Liberal government had been the incumbent. They did have the most seats, but they didn't have a majority. The NDP and the Greens, who between them had a majority, had come to a deal, but the incumbent premier asked the lieutenant governor to face the House anyway, which she did and lost. And then she went and asked for an election. And the lieutenant governor of British Columbia said no. And that's a reserve power of the crown to say no. Usually the lieutenant governor, governor general, queen, as the case may be, is not supposed to say no. There's a few small number of areas where they still have that right, and calling an election is one of them. The role of ministers versus deputy ministers versus the clerk. I'm sure everybody's heard of ministers. Most people have heard of deputy ministers. Some people may not have heard of the clerk. Those are all very important but distinct players in the executive branch. So ministers, of course, as we all know, are elected people who oversee a portfolio of the government. But what a lot of people don't realize is the ministers are not the chief executives of their departments. Their deputy ministers are. The minister's role is more akin to a board of directors. And the deputy minister more like the chief executive officer. The minister is supposed to set kind of the long-term vision and objectives, but it's the deputy minister who hires and fires, that manages the staff, that kind of sets the operating plan and ensures that the day-to-day work occurs. And those deputy ministers do not answer to the minister. They answer to the premier. All the deputy ministers are appointed to the premier, by the premier, sorry. They have an annual performance review with the premier. They can be fired by the premier, not the minister. The minister has no role in that other than that the premier might consult them. And then that brings us to the clerk. The clerk is the chief deputy minister. He or she is the premier's deputy minister, and the deputy ministers take their day-to-day direction and are managed by the clerk. So the clerk is kind of the lesser known figure, but usually after the premier, and depending on the government setup, maybe the premier's chief of staff, the clerk is the most powerful person in the government, but it's somebody that nobody's ever heard of. And then you have the prime minister or the premier, cabinet and committees and how those all work. So the lieutenant governor and council, if you read legislation, you will see that phrase over and over and over. That means the cabinet. The lieutenant governor acting on council, and then her councilors are the cabinet. And so how cabinet works is the premier, there's never a vote at cabinet, and nothing is ever defeated in cabinet. The cabinet can approve something, It can table something to consider it later, or it can order or ask or recommend that the item be withdrawn. We have a concept in our system called cabinet solidarity. And so the notion is that everybody in the cabinet supports a decision of the cabinet. All cabinet decisions are unanimous. So if a minister had an item before cabinet that was defeated, uh, it doesn't work, right? You can't bring something forward and then it be defeated and then there be unanimity because why did you bring it forward? So rather than things being defeated, they're withdrawn. If there's going to be, if it's clear cabinet's going to approve it, then the minister just withdraws the item before there's ever a decision taken. And as it's by consensus and de facto unanimity, the premier decides what cabinet has decided. So in the event that you have 15 ministers and 14 are against, but the premier's in favor, it passes. And if ministers don't like that, their only real recourse is to resign, which we rarely see in this country. But in the UK, usually several times per year, every year, ministers resign. And the reason they state is they disagreed with the cabinet decision. And that's kind of the way it's supposed to work. And then there's cabinet committees that work the same way. Some of those committees might be chaired by the premier or the minister of finance, and I believe that's the case for the two committees that exist in New Brunswick right now. Sometimes there are more committees chaired by different ministers, and they function the same way. There's no vote. The chair decides what the committee's consensus is, and much like a board committee, those recommendations go to the full cabinet, usually just to be rubber stamped, although sometimes there might be a debate or change. Judicial branch, I won't spend a lot of time on this. There's not a lot of influence to be done there. And it's a process that none of us really want to have to go through, either to have initiated a legal process or have been dragged into one. Lobbying, so just on the American versus Canadian context, I'll tell a little story. What people perceive lobbying to be is usually what they've seen through American news media or film. I once worked as a lobbyist in Ottawa for a number of years. We had an American software company that was hiring us. We had been dealing with their local Ottawa-based sales team, and then I get passed over to their legal team at their head office in the US to negotiate a contract. And they sent me their template lobbyist contract because they had dozens and dozens of lobbyists, one in almost every state, several different ones in Washington lobbying different parts of the federal government. Their template contract was over 60 pages long. It included requirements like we needed to carry lobbyist insurance, which apparently is a thing in the US, doesn't exist here, etc. So I went back to the guy and I said, look, this doesn't really seem fit to purpose. Let me send you our template contract, which was 3 pages long. And 3 or 4 hours later, this had all been by email. My phone rings and he says, it's so-and-so from such and such a company. And I just had a question. After I looked at your contract, I read the Canadian Lobbyist Registration Act, and I'm confused. What is it that you guys intend to do for us? Because as far as I can tell, lobbying is illegal in Canada. And the type of lobbying that goes on in the US is illegal in Canada. What is lobbying in Canada is very, very broadly defined. The legislation says that if you're paid to communicate or arrange a meeting with government, you're lobbying. And there's 2 types of lobbyists. There's consultant lobbyists, which is a part of my business. I tend to try to focus more on public relations and strategy, but consultants aren't in the business of turning away work, so we do some lobbying as well. And then there's in-house lobbyists, and that it would be folks like the Chamber, maybe a CEO or a director of public affairs at a company that talks to government a lot. And those people have to register as well. I've had clients who've been very, very surprised, who do a lot of business with government. They hire me to help them, and I say, are you guys registered? And they say, well, what do you mean? We're not lobbyists. But they are, under the law, in-house lobbyists. And I'll talk about, I guess I'll talk about that a little more here. So the definition varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But here in New Brunswick, if you have 0.2 of an FTE that's talking to government. So that is to say, maybe you spend 10% of your time and a colleague spends 5% of their time and another colleague spends 5% of their time talking to the government in a given month, then you need to register as a corporation that has in-house lobbyists. There's a registration system for that. Federally, it's been around since 1989. Provincially, it's quite new. And most jurisdictions, including New Brunswick and Ottawa, have an independent commissioner that oversees that process, helps people figure their way through it, and enforces compliance. And just to go back, there's a lot of people that don't register because they don't understand that they need to register. And, you know, if it's innocent, there's not a lot of enforcement action. But for example, if the Legion in Dopetown wanted to contact the Regional Development Corporation and ask for a grant to replace the windows, and they spent 20% of their time doing one person's time doing that, they would have to register. It's a very, very broad definition. The case study I want to tell you about is festivals. And in the mid 2000s, I never know what to call that first decade, but you know what I mean. There was a series of events. So in 2004, there was an Auditor General's report that talked about the sponsorship scandal that folks may remember. It was something that had been set up after the Quebec referendum in '95 to really show the flag, show the Canadian brand in Quebec, make sure that every dollar that was spent in Quebec from the federal government had a Canadian government logo on it, and really kind of remind Quebecers that the federal government was doing things in Quebec. It wasn't a program just for Quebec. It did sponsor programs across the country, including the Harvest Jazz and Blues Festival, for example. But it was mainly in Quebec. There was a disproportionate amount of money in Quebec, and there was a lot of abuse in Quebec. So after that Auditor General's report, that program was canceled, and there were a lot of unintended consequences. There were a number of festivals across the country, particularly in Quebec, but not only, that were not quite sure how they could continue with this loss of funding. By the time this all kind of came into play, Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, very little representation from Quebec. The main drivers of this concern, the two festivals that were really, really at risk, were Just for Laughs in Montreal and the Carnival de Bonhomme in Quebec City. They had no relationships with the real influencers in the new Harper government. And so they hired us to try to help them figure this out. So one of the things we started to do was identify stakeholders that were influential to government, rather than this be, I think at first it was just for Laughs, and then they threw in a few other Quebec festivals. We quickly got the Calgary Stampede on board, which was quite helpful, where the Prime Minister and 3 or 4 of the most senior ministers were all from Calgary. And we started to socialize that. It ended up being a broad national coalition of large festivals. The House of Commons Finance Committee has a process every year where they travel across the country and they solicit input on what should go in the budget. We arranged to have festivals in every region go and present, talk about for the need for this funding. We got that funding recommended in the House Finance Committee report by talking to a number of committee members about the importance and encouraging them to push that recommendation forward. We then took that and lobbied the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister to accept that recommendation from the committee, and they did. And that's actually when the real work begins, because a provincial budget, federal budget, if there's a new initiative in the budget, it's maybe 1 or 2 sentences, there's no details. And as we all know, the devil's in the details. So after a budget announces a new program, there's another process that takes a few months where there's recommended terms of reference or terms and conditions of how that funding will be processed, and that has to go through a cabinet committee and be approved. So as our clients were celebrating after Jim Flaherty announced this in the budget, we were saying, now hold on, what if the cabinet committee comes out with terms and conditions that say X and Y and you don't even qualify for the funding you've spent the last 3 years trying to get established? So we had to carry through that. We got favorable terms and conditions, and those festivals across the country were able to regain federal sponsorship, and that program continues today. So that's my long rambly thing, and I'm sorry if everybody's asleep. Maybe Morgan can run a buzzer to wake them up when I do this slide, but the gist of it is government is cumbersome and redundant. And there's a couple of things I would say on that. One of the most dangerous words or phrases that you might hear someone say about being able to get something done in government is, oh, don't worry, I know the minister. Well, the minister has a schedule that might run from 7 in the morning to 10 at night, and it's every half hour. They have a meeting with person X, then person Y, then they have a briefing, then they have a meeting with person Z, then they go to question period, then they scrum, then they get to do a couple interviews, then they have another meeting, then they have a cabinet committee meeting, then they have 2 more meetings with stakeholders, then they have and it goes on and on and on like that. So you go in and you have a relationship with the minister. The minister will be happy to meet with you. You sit down with the minister, you have a great conversation. The minister likes what you have to say, and by the time it gets to lunchtime, the minister's had 7 more meetings and forgets that they even had a conversation with you. So the follow-up is very important. And what I've often described our role as lobbyists or government affairs advisors is as a map maker. It's not about influence peddling like lobbying is in the US. It's about understanding the process and figuring out the way through it and in the right steps. So for example, I would recommend that you never go see the minister as your first step, because as soon as you request a meeting with the minister, the deputy minister will request a briefing note. And the briefing note will kind of cause the department to make its opinion on your issue. And that will happen before you even talk to the minister. So what you do is you should go and see the director of whatever at the Department of X and brief them, get them to understand the issue from your perspective. And then you ask for a meeting with the minister, and all of a sudden the briefing note that gets written is informed by what you've told the official. You go straight to the minister, you may have damaged yourself by having the entire system socialize themselves on your issue from a perhaps biased context without ever talking to you. And then you're spending your whole time trying to get that briefing note changed. Better to change it before it gets written. And that's an example of it, how difficult it is for business to understand how government works, because that's crazy, and vice versa. We have a hybrid of written and unwritten rules in this country, which is something I talked about at the beginning, which can also make it confusing. How the legislature works, how the cabinet works, that's not written down in any document. It's all tradition and precedent. And government action often requires what I would call a multi-front war. You need to talk to the bureaucrats. You need to talk to the political people, elected and their staff. You may need to talk to local political people if you're a company in a region to help carry your message. In a minority government, you need to talk to opposition parties. If you might be seen as too narrow, like the Just for Laughs Festival, you might need to get a coalition of like-minded people together. And that's all really, really important if you want to have success. So that's my presentation. And I'd be happy to take any questions that people might have.
I don't see any questions in the chat yet. A fairly small group. If anyone has one, feel free to jump in, I would say, or use the chat. To start off, I'm really interested in the idea that the deputy ministers don't report to the ministers. That's news to me. So my mind is reeling about the consequences of that now. My question is more about, I think we all understand there's a lot of factors that go into appointing ministers. I'm curious to your thoughts on how big a factor is previous experience, someone's familiarity with the subject matter, and how important do you think that is?
It really depends. There are, as you say, a lot of factors that need to be factored in. First of all, is what's the pool that you have to select from, right? The president of the United States can choose any one of 300 million Americans to be in his cabinet. The premier of New Brunswick today has 20 colleagues to choose from to make a cabinet. So this isn't meant to suggest that the quality or whatever, but it's slim pickings. Your universe of choice is a very, very narrow. Even a large majority government in New Brunswick, let's see, the biggest one we've had lately was the Allward government, and I think he had 41 or 2 members. So he had to choose 15 or 17 ministers out of 40 people. That's, you know, not a lot of optionality. Even federally, it's a lot better. You have a cabinet of 30 or 35 people, and a majority government might have 180 people to choose from. So the degree of choice is quite small. So you're often not, you often don't have the luxury of even finding anybody with any subject matter experience. The last government, Brian Gallant's government, after Sarah's Russell retired, Brian Gallant was the only lawyer, so he had no option but to choose himself for Attorney General, right? And similarly, Mr. Higgs has 2 lawyers to choose from, so I don't know how he chose between Ted Fleming and Andrea Anderson Mason, but it's not like he had a lot of choice. So there's that. But there are other factors, as you say. There's a lot of expectation for gender balance. There's certainly a lot of expectation for regional balance. And a lot of people who aren't as familiar with government think that that's all ridiculous. I mean, pick the right people for the right jobs. But you got to keep in mind that you're picking people for 2 different jobs. You're picking somebody to be kind of the policy direction for a department with a particular area of say so. But you're also picking a member of the cabinet who makes a lot of collective decisions on behalf of the whole province and has a lot of power. And you want that cabinet to be representative of all the voices and interests in New Brunswick, because there's a lot of decisions that are made that are never discussed at the legislature, the decision-making bodies, the cabinet. So you want that cabinet to be representative of all perspectives. So you want to choose the best minister of finance and the best minister of health, but you also want to make sure that when you roll that all up, it's not all 60-year-old white guys from Rossay, because then, you know, are they going to understand all of the issues that they collectively need to decide on? And then just another thing I'll say to you, in my experience, I probably shouldn't say this, this is being recorded, but teachers are terrible education ministers. Doctors are usually not very good health ministers, because the education system is more than just teachers. The health system in particular is more than just doctors, and they come to it with such a narrow view. I mean, a patient, as we all are, might be more understanding of the needs of the health system than a doctor, because the doctor would understand the needs of doctors within the health system. And we have thousands of people working in the Department of Health and the health authorities to understand the nitty gritty. And sometimes you see the same thing in the private sector. A mining company might hire a CEO that has never worked in mining before because they need a really good manager who can set a strategic vision and manage performance, because they've got 5 VPs that have spent their whole career in mining. So it's the same kind of idea in government sometimes.
Thank you. We've got a question in the chat with regard to lobbyist registries. Does the organization register as the in-house lobbyist or the individual working within the organization?
So it's both, I think. Federally, this is the case. I'm not 100% sure how the provincial registration works for in-house lobbyists, because I haven't done it before. But I believe they both work the same way. And certainly federally, how it works is you register the company, and then you have to register the CEO underneath that registration, and then anybody within the company who would communicate with government is listed. That's how it works federally. I think it works the same way provincially.
It is the same provincially too. Krista and I are both individually registered and underneath the chamber. Any other questions from the floor? Do you find any of the lobbyist registries overly restrictive? I mean, New Brunswick is really the only one I'm familiar with, and it seems to have very little teeth or restrictions in any way. We just kind of register for 6 months and list all the departments we might want to meet with. And
yeah, so that's how they all used to be. I went through the transformation federally. So when Stephen Harper was elected, he had a lot of stuff on accountability and transparency in his first platform. And one of the first thing they did was bring forward new lobbyist registration rules. And it's very, very, very more robust federally now. It's also, but I prefer it because it's way more user friendly. I'm sure you've seen this provincial lobbyist registration system is pretty clunky. But in terms of restrictions, they vary. New Brunswick would be at one end of the spectrum in terms of how strict it is, and it's the least strict. So in New Brunswick, for example, you have to disclose whether or not you're working on a success fee basis, but it's allowed. Most provinces, it's not allowed, and federally, it's not allowed. In Nova Scotia, there's a fee to register, and it's not cheap. It's, I think, $60 a registration. Which I guess isn't expensive either, but where any other jurisdiction I've dealt with, it's free. So it was a big shock to me the first time I registered in Nova Scotia. Federally, you have to disclose every meeting you have with a person of a certain level. So you have your 6-month registration, but then anytime you meet with a minister, ML or MP, senator, there's any of those people's staff, a deputy minister or an assistant deputy minister federally, you have to disclose that meeting and what day it took place and what was discussed at a very, very high level because they are sensitive to commercially sensitive information. If Bell goes in and has a meeting, they don't really want Rogers to be able to go and read what they just discussed with the minister, so it is at a high level. So it varies from place to place, but you're right, in New Brunswick, I mean, you register, there's not really a lot of validation and there's not really a lot of enforcement. The challenge we have, though, I would say, that has never been addressed, the federal thing got way more restrictive, but it's kind of the same argument people make about the gun registry, which maybe weakens the merit of this argument, but law-abiding people register. The problem is people that don't register. And there's a lot of unregistered lobbying going on, and I'm not talking about the Doketown Legion that didn't realize they had to register. And that's a problem, and really they should spend a lot more time trying to crack down on that. And the other piece is that there's a lot of companies that do work for government and do work lobbying government. And so I've known instances of people that have gone in to meet with the minister to brief the minister on the work product they produced for the minister. And then while they're in the room, they shift gears and say, oh, by the way, I'm working for so-and-so and they really need you to approve this regulation. Would you mind doing that? Which is kind of an unfair level of access. So I personally think lobbyist registration rules are good. Transparency is good. People should know what everybody's doing. And make their own judgments, but we really need a lot more enforcement of finding people that aren't registered and getting them registered. And you can't have people on the take from the government and then using that access to lobby on behalf of clients, which is allowed right now.
Anybody else? Okay, I've got more. I'm wondering your thoughts about how much time and effort you would, generally speaking, put into communicating with opposition parties. I imagine a majority versus minority government would drive a lot of that, but maybe in both scenarios, or any other general thoughts you have about the effectiveness of that.
So as a general rule, it's hard to put a general rule. I got several different contexts, but as a general rule, I would say that's a kind of in case of emergency break glass here thing. Because when you go to the opposition and it's anything negative about the government, they're going to use that to their advantage, and the government's going to be annoyed that you made their life difficult, and it probably is going to be counterproductive. But if you're getting nowhere with government and you're banging your head against the wall, then why not? So that's why I would say, in case of emergency, it can be a little bit different in a minority situation. But still, it wouldn't be the first thing I would recommend. When it does change, though, is you're leading into an election and you want to influence opposition parties' platforms in case they become the government, then I would certainly recommend talking to opposition parties, you know, in the 6 to 12 months before an election, but don't wait too late. Like, I don't know how many times I have seen people come in July and August and there's an election in September, looking to influence platforms. Well, a well-organized party's platform's already been printed by July. So, you know, it's 6 to 12 months before is the sweet spot, I would say.
Anybody else?
I think they're all still asleep, Morgan.
Oh, that's fine for them. That's the best webinar we've done so far. I don't want to dominate. Anybody? Going once?
Oh, there was one. Oh, just
excellent presentation.
Thank you.
No questions. Great presentation. Great. When are we going to have a provincial election?
Oh, that's $1 million question.
That's why I'm asking you, the guy who knows things.
So I have heard a lot of people be convinced there was going to be an election last June, last November, and I never believed it. I did think there was going to be an election this winter, early spring, and I think there would have been if we didn't have the pandemic. And now the big talk is that there'll be an election in the early fall. I think that was the front page of the paper today. And that's, I kind of sort of believe that. I know the Premier a bit, and my impression is he's real interested in electioneering. He doesn't really mind the minority situation, and he's very much focused on governing, and whether or not he has a majority, I don't think he really cares. So I don't think he's got a burning desire to go to the polls. But Robert Gauvin has crossed the floor. He's sitting as an independent, but he seems to be voting with the Liberals. If you were to have all three of these by-elections and they all went Liberal, which isn't super likely, but hypothetically, the Liberals in Gauvin would have 24 seats and the Conservatives would have 20 after those by-elections. So that would create a pretty weird situation. Would the Premier then call an election after the by-elections? Would he try to govern? Would the Liberals, we talked about reserve powers of the Crown, theoretically the Liberals could form a government if they got 25 votes without having an election. I don't know how acceptable people would find that, but it is within the rules. So because of all that uncertainty, I would think if I was advising the Premier, I would tell him to go, particularly if things continue to be relatively calm on the pandemic front through the summer. And there's precedent. In 2006, Bernard Lord had just passed fixed election laws, and the election was fixed for the fall of 2007. And exact same scenario that happened now. One of his MLAs, as Bruce Northrop, for those of you that don't follow that closely, Bruce Northrop, one of the government MLAs, has announced he's going to go before the House comes back for the fall. Peter Michaud made the exact same announcement in the summer of 2006, and Bernard Lord said, I'm not going to risk one by-election in one riding, flipping the balance of power and allowing the government to change without a general election. I don't think that that's right. I don't think it's democratic. So to avoid that risk, I'm going to have a general election, and Premier Higgs could make the same argument. I think he'd be justified in doing so, and there's precedent for it. So I'm not saying I'm sure there's going to be an election in the early fall, but I think it's a lot more likely than it was a week or two ago.
Makes sense to me. Last call for questions. I'm going to stop now. Nobody? Okay. Thank you, Jordan, again for your time this morning. Like I said, this is being recorded. We'll have it posted on our website later today, which we'll share and include in our upcoming newsletters. And thanks everyone for attending, and have a great day.
Thanks everyone.